Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I am honored to be able to speak among so many distinguished leaders around the world. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. So I'm going to share my screen so that I can show you some slides to illustrate my talk. And let me just bring these up here for you. What I'm going to talk to you about today are some ways in which my own academy has built a framework for dealing with this pandemic, this horrible pandemic, which in my own country has affected more than 7 million people through infections and has killed more than 200,000 people and counting. So science in crisis is special. It is unlike the normal pace of science at other times when we aren't in crisis mode. It has opportunities and it has challenges. The opportunities is, first of all, as a scientist, you feel that you have the prospect for making a difference on something that truly matters to society. It is not your esoteric science that no one cares about, but you feel that you might actually make a difference to people, to their health, to their well-being, and to the environment. The intense focus promotes teamwork. Everyone pulls together in ways that don't happen during non-crisis times. And it's an opportunity to illustrate to society the value of science. Science can actually deliver, and it can be science's greatest moment. But there are challenges too. Every crisis is in some way novel. And so you can't just say whatever worked in the last crisis will work in this crisis. And the urgency requires building on prior work. We've seen, particularly in this crisis, that investments we made in basic research over the past decades have actually served us well in trying to come up with a vaccine, in coming up with tests for the coronavirus, and in other ways. The conventional pace of science validation is too slow. We have to post our papers on preprint servers in order to share our science rapidly. We can't wait for a year for papers to come out. And the stakes are high on getting the answer right. We can't afford to be wrong. And so at the Academy, we've developed this framework of 3 different categories of the type of science we are delivering. The first on the left is actionable science. Now, actionable science is the quickest form of science that we deliver. Actionable science is defined as science which is delivered to a decision maker, and it is communicated in terms that a decision maker will understand, and it is framed in terms of the decision at hand. It is of the highest quality that the timeliness of the decision will allow. And very often, these actionable science has to be delivered within days or less than a week in order to have an impact. And an example would be, how do we flatten the curve in terms of the rise in cases in order to not overwhelm the healthcare system? The second category on the right is strategic science. And in strategic science, while the actionable science is dealing with the tactical issues, what's happening right now that we have to jump right on, the strategic science is dealing with the long tail in the pandemic. Not what's happening right now, but what could happen in the future that we need to worry about, because if we don't worry about it now, it could catch us unaware. So what are the consequences of the pandemic that could cascade from the virus into the economy, into the social fabric of society, into our infrastructure perhaps, and even into national security. And if we find that that cascade of consequences could happen and is not good, what robust strategies can we develop that could prevent that cascade of consequences from happening and intervene in a timely way? And then the third type of science that we are developing at the Academy is irreplaceable science. And irreplaceable science is the sort of science that could only be done in a crisis, such as a pandemic, like studying what happens when everyone is locked up at home and social distancing from each other. How do we study the effect of social isolation? Or how do we study what wildlife does when suddenly people are no longer out in the forest? Or what happens to whales in the ocean when there's no more noise in the seas? These are the kinds of experiments that you couldn't do purposefully, but the pandemic allows you to do. So I'm going to give examples of each of these. So for actionable science, we stood up groups of scientists to deliver, sometimes with days turnaround, sometimes with several days turnaround, a number of requests from our government and from other groups, answers to questions such as, for COVID-19, what are crisis standards of care and what are staffing needs? How can we encourage people to adopt protective behaviors? What's the effectiveness of masks? What's the science behind social distancing? All sorts of questions that were all delivered with days turnaround, not the usual Academy's leisurely pace of delivering its advice. One report that we just recently delivered was an equitable framework for allocation of the vaccine once it becomes available. And in keeping with the Pontiff's imploring of our communities to take into account ethical principles, we put out an allocation framework which has a goal of reducing severe morbidity and mortality and negative social impact that has ethical principles built in, a maximum benefit, equal concern, mitigation and health inequalities, and fairness, transparency, and evidence base. So how can we make sure we are being moral and ethical in our distribution of the vaccine? And then in terms of strategic science, here's just one example of what we're doing. We're doing this by doing scenario development, and these scenarios are being examined by interdisciplinary teams of experts looking for robust interventions. So here's one scenario we're working on. And I'm speaking to you today from California. And California has an economy that produces $50 billion a year of fruit and vegetables. That $50 billion a year of fruit and vegetables is mostly dependent on a community of migrant farm laborers who are Hispanic largely in their nationality. So the scenario we're looking at in this case is what happens if the migrant farm workers fall ill. This is a very vulnerable community because they work in close proximity to each other in the fields. They live in close proximity to each other in barracks as they move around the state to follow the harvest. And many of them are very reluctant to go to seek help when they fall ill, because first of all, they need the money. And secondly, they're concerned about the immigration force deporting them if they seek help. So pandemic is very likely to take a large toll on the migrant farm worker community. And if they fall ill, if the pandemic takes them out, our food supply in this country will be disrupted. And then if the food supply is disrupted because the farm workers are unable to do it, one potential cascading consequence of this is that the farms will become mechanized and the workers will be replaced by machines. That is a trend that has already started, but the pandemic could put it over the edge. And then the migrant farm workers would be without employment. If we see this cascade of consequences starting, or if we even think it could happen, how can we intervene now to stop it from happening? We could intervene either by preventing the migrant farm workers from becoming ill, or we could intervene with a program that could educate them so that they could become the workers that actually build and maintain the machines to get better jobs for the migrant farm workers and improve their status and their quality of life. Either of these could be robust interventions for this particular scenario and would be in keeping with the goal of using science to deal with the most vulnerable in society. In terms of irreplaceable science, it's the sort of science experiments that, as I say, could not be done intentionally. So for example, what happens to the incidence of mental illness when the elderly are isolated from their families and others for long periods of time? And if we find that this is extremely detrimental to their well-being, does this information inform future scenarios for how to better manage pandemic? Or does this information inform technology development for how isolation can be managed while still managing infection rates? And then let me end by talking a little bit about crisis communications. Communication in crisis has always been a challenge. I did a lot of work in crisis during the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, but I have to say that during that oil spill, while there were some rumors going around that were false that we had to put to rest, there was no intent to purposefully misinform people. And yet in this crisis, we have seen attempts to purposely misinform people. And so now that there is that, the importance of crisis communication is even more important. One example I've shown here is the most common false information around the coronavirus has been seen on the web by large amounts of people, that drinking water can flush out the infection. That's seen by 35% of adults online, and other examples are shown here. This is a problem that the Academy has been addressing through partnerships with online providers such as Google. Let me go to this one. Since I know time, I might go back to the last one. So we have, in partnership with Google, we have a new program called Based on Science, where Google flags for us the largest misinformation on the web. And we work with scientists and science writers to develop content that actually counters that misinformation. We've been doing that on climate change and certain areas of public health, but now the coronavirus epidemic has actually doubled the amount of content we have in countering misinformation on the web. And here are some of the topics. These are just a small portion of the topics we have on COVID-19 on the web. And Google helps make sure that when people search on these topics on COVID-19, that our correct information is placed in the search higher than the misinformation. And then finally, let me just go back to the one I skipped. Because there is, the pace of science is so fast, we've been working with journalists to help them understand that there is a hierarchy even to the trustworthiness of science itself. On the left, a single incidence of an observation or an observational study is less trustworthy than, say, to the right, information that is obtained from a double-blind controlled study that has been pre-registered. And so we're helping to try to help the press understand that not even all peer-reviewed research is equally trustworthy. So I will end there. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you. I think it's very important in times of crisis, we understand the special nature of science and use everything in our toolbox to help science get us through this crisis and help society obtain the tools it needs to be healthy, to be safe, and to prosper. Thank you very much.